He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The silence after his words was sharp enough to cut through aluminium. "You can step off the flight deck now," the captain said, eyes forward, hands resting on the yoke as if it already belonged to him alone. The engines were cold. The door was still open. Everyone had heard him. The woman in the right seat did not move. She felt the vibration of the ground cart through the floor, the faint tremor under her boots. She counted her breath without looking at him. 1, 2, 3. Outside the cockpit window, the Arizona sun bleached the ramp into a flat, white glare. Inside, the air smelled of leather, old coffee, and something metallic that never quite went away. A smell she knew well. Captain Douglas Kincaid was 64 years old and carried himself like a man who had not been told no since Reagan was in office. His uniform was immaculate. His shoulders were square. His jaw was set in a way that suggested decisions were final, not discussed. He had the look of a man who believed the sky still rewarded nerve more than discipline. "I'm not comfortable with this setup," he continued, voice calm, almost polite. "Operations will find a replacement. We're not flying like this." The co-pilot finally turned her head. Not fast, not defensive, just enough to meet his reflection in the dark glass of the standby instruments. Her name was Marianne Cole. She was 53. Her hair was pulled back tight, no stray strands, no softness offered. Her hands rested on her knees, steady, fingers relaxed. She had learned a long time ago that stillness unnerved people more than anger. "Can you be specific, Captain?" she asked. Her voice was even, no challenge, no apology. "About what makes you uncomfortable?" He exhaled through his nose, a small sound, contained, irritation disguised as patience. "This aircraft is new to the fleet. This client is sensitive. I prefer a certain rhythm in my cockpit." He glanced at her, just long enough. "And I don't like surprises." That was the word. Surprise. It hung there, thin and loaded. Behind the cockpit door, someone shifted their weight. A soft shuffle. A throat cleared. The flight attendant, a woman young enough to be his granddaughter, stood frozen in the aisle, one hand still gripping the curtain. She had heard everything. So had the passenger. Marianne could feel him back there without turning around. The presence of money had weight. It pressed into the cabin, into the walls, into the decisions people made without realizing they were making them. The client was Harold Bennett, 72 years old, real estate money from the Midwest, a man who flew private because he no longer tolerated inconvenience. He had boarded smiling. He had stopped smiling 5 minutes ago. Marianne adjusted her seatbelt. The soft click echoed louder than it should have. "There's nothing in my record that should disrupt your rhythm," she said. "I've flown this route more times than I can count. I've reviewed the maintenance release. Weather is stable. The aircraft is clean." Douglas turned fully toward her now. His eyes were pale blue, sharp, assessing. The kind of eyes that decided quickly and rarely revised their judgment. "I didn't ask for your resume," he said. "I asked for compliance." There it was. Not shouted, not crude, clean, surgical. Marianne felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear, not anger. Recognition. She had heard variations of this sentence in conference rooms, briefing halls, hangars that smelled of fuel and old pride. It always came wrapped in professionalism. It always pretended to be about procedure. "I'm assigned to this flight," she said, "by the company." Douglas smiled then, just slightly. A crease at the corner of his mouth. "That can be fixed." He reached for the phone mounted beside the throttle quadrant. His movements were deliberate, performative. He wanted her to see that this was easy for him. Routine. "Dispatch," he said when the line connected. "This is Kincaid on the Sierra 7. I need a different right seat. Immediately." Marianne watched his reflection as he spoke. The confidence, the certainty that the system would bend the way it always had. She imagined the web of assumptions tightening around the moment. Seniority, reputation, comfort. Outside, a fuel truck rolled past, its engine coughing. Somewhere on the ramp, a radio crackled. Life went on. "Copy that, Captain," came the voice on the other end. Male. Younger. Hesitant. "Can you clarify the issue?" Douglas did not hesitate. "Crew compatibility." Marianne felt the word land like a verdict. Vague enough to be safe, sharp enough to wound. She leaned back in her seat. Her gaze drifted to the placard on the bulkhead. Small, brushed metal, engraved letters catching the light. The aircraft registration. The owner line beneath it. She did not look at it long. She didn't need to. Behind them, Harold Bennett shifted in his seat. The leather creaked. He closed his laptop slowly. The sound carried forward, a quiet punctuation mark. "Captain," Marianne said, softly now. "If you ground this flight, the delay will cost more than time." Douglas covered the mouthpiece with his hand and looked at her, irritation flashing. "This is not your concern." She met his eyes. "It is." He laughed then, a short breath of disbelief. "You're out of your lane." The word lane hit her harder than she expected. She thought of nights sleeping in hangars, of logbooks thick with ink, of decisions made under pressure when no one was watching. She thought of how many times she had swallowed words to keep a system running smoothly. She unbuckled her harness. The sound was loud in the small space. Douglas stiffened. "What are you doing?" "I'm stepping out," she said. "Not because you asked. Because this is about to become bigger than both of us." She stood slowly, deliberately, and turned toward the cabin. Harold Bennett was already on his feet. For a man his age, he moved well. His expression was not angry. It was curious. Dangerous in a different way. "Is there a problem?" he asked, voice calm, Midwest vowels rounded and precise. Douglas opened his mouth, already shaping the answer he had given 100 times in different rooms. Marianne spoke first. "There is," she said, "and it needs to be handled carefully." Harold studied her face, the set of her jaw, the steadiness in her eyes. He glanced at Douglas, then back at her. "Well," he said after a moment, "that makes two of us who don't like surprises." The cabin fell quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before a storm, when the air seems to hold its breath. Marianne felt it then, the shift, the moment where momentum changed direction, not because of volume or force, but because someone finally noticed who was standing in front of them. She did not reveal anything. Not yet. She simply reached into her flight bag and closed it with care, the zipper whispering shut. Douglas watched her, unease creeping into his posture for the first time. He sensed it too, though he did not yet know why. The old instinct that had once kept him alive flickered, confused. On the ramp, the sun climbed higher. Inside the cockpit, the story had already left the runway. Douglas Kincaid had not moved. Not his hands, not his shoulders. Only his eyes tracked Marianne as she stood in the aisle, half turned toward the cabin, her body forming a quiet barrier between the cockpit and the man paying for the flight. The silence stretched. It was no longer empty. It was evaluative. Harold Bennett took a step forward. The carpet muted his shoes, but the movement still felt loud. He was tall for his age, shoulders slightly stooped, the posture of someone who had learned to lean forward into resistance rather than away from it. His face carried the calm of a man who had watched markets collapse and wars begin on television screens he owned outright. He had patience, and he had memory. "I don't like delays," Harold said, not looking at Douglas. His eyes stayed on Marianne. "But I dislike confusion even more." Douglas cleared his throat. "Sir, there's no safety issue, just an internal crew matter. We'll have you airborne shortly." Marianne felt the word safety echo in her chest. She had learned to hear the absence inside it. Safety used as a shield. Safety used as a weapon. Safety used to end conversations without answering them. "With respect," she said, "that's not accurate." Douglas turned sharply. "You're done here." She didn't flinch. "I'm not." Harold's brow lifted slightly, a micro-expression, interest sharpened by contradiction. "Then tell me," he said, plainly. Marianne inhaled. The air felt dry. She chose her words carefully, not because she was afraid, but because she understood gravity. "The captain has declined to fly with the assigned crew configuration. That decision will trigger a delay of no less than 40 minutes, potentially longer. The reason given was compatibility." Harold looked at Douglas now, not accusing, just waiting. Douglas forced a smile that did not reach his eyes. "I've been flying jets longer than most people in this airport have been alive. I know when something feels off." Marianne felt it then, the familiar tightening behind the sternum, the old reflex to let it go, to step back, to let a man with seniority take the narrative and move on. She had done that before, too many times. "Feelings don't move airplanes," she said quietly. "Procedures do." The words landed heavier than she intended. Douglas's jaw flexed. His hand curled against the armrest. He did not raise his voice, but the air around him changed, sharpened. "Watch yourself," he said. Harold exhaled slowly. The sound was deliberate. He had heard that tone before, in boardrooms, in courtrooms, in conversations where power assumed obedience. "I don't know much about flying," he said, "but I know about people. And right now, I see one man trying to shut another one down without explaining why." Marianne met his gaze. "I'm not a man." Harold nodded once. "No, you're not." Douglas opened his mouth, closed it. His confidence faltered, just a fraction, enough to notice. The flight attendant shifted behind Harold, eyes wide, hands clasped tight at her waist. She looked from one face to another, breath shallow. She had learned early what not to say in moments like this. "Captain," Harold said, his voice calm but firm now. "If you're grounding this flight, I want to know exactly why. Not in general terms. Not in code." Douglas leaned back in his seat, the leather creaking. He looked past Marianne, past Harold, toward the windshield where the runway waited, patient and indifferent. For a moment, he seemed tired. Then the old certainty reasserted itself. "I don't trust her judgment," he said. Marianne felt the sentence like a physical impact. Not because it was unexpected, because it was naked. "On what basis?" Harold asked. Douglas turned. "On experience." Marianne spoke before Harold could. "I flagged a maintenance anomaly during walk-around, logged it according to procedure. The captain disagreed with my assessment." Douglas snapped his head toward her. "That's not what this is about." "But it's when things changed," she said. "For you." The cockpit felt smaller. The hum of ground power filled the space, suddenly intrusive. Harold took another step forward, closer now, his presence undeniable. "What anomaly?" he asked. Marianne hesitated for half a beat, not because she doubted herself, because she knew how much weight truth carried once spoken. "A minor hydraulic seep, within tolerance, but covered by a service bulletin issued last week." Douglas stiffened. "Maintenance cleared it." "They cleared it based on your verbal report," Marianne said. "Not on the photograph I logged." Harold's gaze sharpened. "There's a bulletin." Douglas's eyes flicked away. "Just for a moment." "That's enough," he said. "This conversation is over." Marianne looked at him then. Really looked. At the lines etched deep around his mouth. At the faint tremor in his left hand. At the fear hiding beneath authority. No, she said. It's just beginning. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. Douglas leaned forward, alarm flashing. Put that away. She didn't. Her thumb moved across the screen, unhurried. She selected a contact, paused, then pressed call. Harold watched her closely now. Who are you calling? The owner of the aircraft, she said. Douglas laughed. It came out sharp, defensive. This is a charter. You don't have that number. The line connected. The faint sound of ringing filled the cabin. I do, Marianne said. She raised the phone to her ear. This is Marianne Cole, she said. I'm on board Sierra 7. We have a crew refusal and a maintenance disagreement. I need guidance. There was a pause, long enough for Douglas's color to shift, just slightly. Yes, Marianne continued. The captain is aware. Harold felt it then. The moment something invisible rearranged itself. He had built his career recognizing inflection points. This was one. Marianne lowered the phone and turned, meeting Douglas's eyes fully now. There was no anger there, no triumph, just certainty. She'll be on speaker in a moment, Marianne said. Before that, I want you to understand something. Douglas swallowed. His throat moved visibly. I didn't board this aircraft to test you, she continued. I boarded it to get from Arizona to California. You made this about power, about comfort, about who gets to decide. Harold felt a chill creep up his spine. He had seen powerful men undone by smaller moments than this. The phone chimed. Marianne tapped the screen. Go ahead, came a woman's voice. Calm, controlled, unmistakably used to being heard. This is Evelyn Cole, the voice said. I'm listening. Douglas's breath left him in a rush. His hands fell from the yoke. The color drained from his face so fast, it looked like a trick of light. Marianne did not look at him. Not yet. Evelyn, she said. We have a captain refusing to fly with assigned crew. He has not read the latest service bulletin. He has overruled a logged maintenance concern, and he is asserting authority without cause. There was a pause, a long one. Harold held his breath. Is the aircraft mine? Evelyn asked. Yes, Marianne said. Then ground the captain, Evelyn replied. Pending review. Douglas found his voice at last. You can't. Marianne turned slowly. Her eyes were steady, unyielding. I already have, she said. The cockpit went silent. Not empty. Final. And in that silence, Douglas Kincaid realized something irreversible had just happened. Not to the flight, not to the company. To him. No one spoke, not at first. The kind of silence that followed was not awkward or confused. It was absolute. The ground power hum seemed louder now, like it was trying to fill a space it didn't belong in. Douglas Kincaid stared at Marianne as if she had stepped through a wall he didn't believe existed. Harold Bennett exhaled slowly and sat back down, his weight settling into the leather seat with a quiet finality. He folded his hands over his cane, the silver handle catching a sliver of light. His eyes never left Douglas. Pending review, Harold repeated softly. Those are serious words. Douglas swallowed. His mouth opened, closed. He tried again. This is a misunderstanding. Marianne felt a familiar ache behind her eyes. Not satisfaction, not triumph. Fatigue. The kind that came from watching a man search for an exit that no longer existed. She stepped back into the cockpit and closed the door behind her. The latch clicked. Clean. Irrevocable. Sir, she said, turning to Harold, for transparency, I need to explain what happens next. Harold nodded. Please do. Marianne faced forward, not toward Douglas. She spoke as if addressing the aircraft itself. The flight is delayed. Another crew will be assigned. The maintenance concern will be inspected by an independent supervisor. The incident will be documented. Douglas leaned forward. You're blowing this out of proportion. Marianne turned then. Slowly, her eyes met his. You attempted to override a logged discrepancy. You refused a crew assignment without cause. You cited comfort instead of procedure. Those are not proportional mistakes. They're cumulative ones. He laughed again, but this time it cracked. You think you're better than me. I think I'm responsible, she said. There's a difference. Harold shifted in his seat. Captain, he said quietly, I've spent my life watching people confuse those two things. It rarely ends well. Douglas looked at him, then away. His shoulders sagged just a little. Enough to betray the strain he had been carrying for years without admitting it. I've kept planes in the air longer than she's had a career, he muttered. Marianne felt the words brush past her without landing. She had stopped measuring herself against men like him a long time ago. Instead, she measured outcomes, consequences, quiet truths. A knock came at the cockpit door. Firm, professional. Marianne opened it to find the operations manager standing there, tablet in hand, face tight with controlled concern. Captain Kincaid, the man said, eyes flicking briefly to Marianne before returning to Douglas. You're being relieved of duty for this leg. Please gather your personal items. Douglas stared at him. You can't do this without a full review. This is the full review for today, the manager replied. The rest happens on the ground. The flight attendant stood behind him, pale but composed, hands clasped tighter than before. She watched Douglas, the way people watched storms on the horizon, with fear and relief intertwined. Douglas rose from his seat slowly. He paused, one hand resting on the back of it. For a moment, he looked around the cockpit as if memorizing it. The instruments, the switches, the space he had ruled without question. Then his eyes landed on the placard again. The owner line. He blinked. Cole, he whispered. Marianne followed his gaze. Yes. Your family, he said. Not a question, a realization. She nodded once. My sister. His breath shuddered out of him. The fight left his posture all at once, like a structure collapsing inward. He nodded once, stiffly, and picked up his bag. As he passed Harold, Harold spoke again. Captain. Douglas stopped. I don't think you're a bad man, Harold said. But I do think you stopped listening a long time ago. Douglas's jaw tightened. He didn't respond. He stepped into the aisle and disappeared toward the stairs, escorted, but not touched, the way the truly fallen often were. The cockpit door closed again. This time, the silence that followed felt different, lighter, but no less heavy. Marianne sank back into the right seat and exhaled for the first time since the morning. Her hands trembled slightly now that there was no need to keep them still. She pressed them flat against her thighs until the sensation passed. Harold leaned forward. You handled that with restraint. She nodded. It didn't feel that way. It never does, he said. The right thing rarely announces itself as such. She glanced back at him. I'm sorry for the delay. Harold smiled faintly. I've delayed deals worth more than this aircraft over less important matters. A radio crackled faintly as the operations manager coordinated outside. The sun had shifted, casting longer shadows across the ramp. Time had moved on without asking permission. Tell your sister, Harold said, that she runs a tight operation. Marianne allowed herself a small smile. She insists on it. Another knock. The manager again. New crew will be here in 20 minutes. Maintenance is inspecting the system now. Marianne stood. I'll assist with the review. He nodded. Of course. As she stepped out onto the ramp, the heat hit her full in the face. The smell of fuel and dust wrapped around her. She spotted Douglas in the distance, walking toward the terminal, shoulders hunched, steps slower than before. No one stared. No one needed to. She turned back toward the aircraft, toward the work that remained. Inside the terminal, Douglas paused near the glass doors. He looked back once, at the jet, at the name, at the life he had assumed would always bend around him. Then he turned away. Back on the ramp, Marianne stood beneath the wing as a technician crouched near the hydraulic panel, flashlight beams steady and precise. She watched carefully, listened, learned. That was the habit that had kept her where she was when others had fallen. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. A message from Evelyn. Handled well. We'll talk later. Marianne slipped the phone away and looked up at the sky. It was wide, indifferent, honest. And for the first time that day, she felt certain the aircraft would leave the ground the way it was supposed to. Not because of power, not because of pride, but because someone had finally refused to look away. The inspection took longer than expected, not because the fault was dramatic, but because it was subtle, the kind of problem that only announced itself if someone was patient enough to listen. Marianne stood a few feet back as the maintenance supervisor eased the panel open, the metal giving with a dull, resistant sound. The flashlight beam cut a clean line across the components, pausing, circling, returning to the same spot again and again. There, the supervisor said finally. His voice carried no triumph, only confirmation. That's not residual. Marianne nodded. She had known before the words arrived. She had felt it in the way the fluid had caught the light, the way it refused to bead like a harmless spill. She folded her arms loosely across her chest, grounding herself. The desert heat pressed down, relentless, unforgiving. Behind them, the replacement captain approached. His name was Alan Pierce, 58, grey at the temples, a man who walked without hurry, without the need to assert himself before speaking. He stopped beside Marianne, eyes on the open panel, taking in the scene without comment. Good call, he said at last. She met his gaze. It wasn't instinct. It was reading. He smiled faintly. That's usually how it goes. Inside the terminal, Douglas Kincaid sat alone in a hard-backed chair near the windows. The glass reflected his face back at him, thinner than he remembered. Older. The uniform that had once felt like armor now weighed on his shoulders. He watched the ramp with the distant focus of a man observing a life he no longer occupied. He had replayed the moment again and again, the way the room had shifted, the sound of Marianne's voice when she said the owner's name, the calm, the certainty. He had mistaken it for insolence, for ambition, for something he could crush with seniority. He closed his eyes briefly. The silence inside his head was worse than the noise had been. A man in a blazer approached and stopped in front of him. Operations, neutral expression, clipboard tucked under one arm. Captain Kincaid, the man said, we'll need your badge. Douglas hesitated. Then he reached into his pocket and placed it on the clipboard. The plastic made a small sound when it landed. Final, unceremonious. This is temporary, Douglas said, though he wasn't sure who he was saying it for. For now, the man replied. You'll be contacted. Douglas nodded. He did not argue. The fight had drained out of him somewhere between the jet bridge and the chair. On the ramp, Harold Bennett watched from the base of the stairs as the maintenance supervisor finished his report. He leaned on his cane, listening with the focus of a man who had built his fortune on recognizing patterns before others did. So if they had taken off, Harold said. The supervisor didn't hedge. We would have grounded it en route, Best case. Worst case, the pump degrades under load. Harold nodded slowly. He glanced at Marianne. You just saved me a long afternoon. She didn't smile. I did my job. He studied her for a moment longer. That's becoming a rare sentence. The delay stretched into an hour, then another. The desert light softened, losing its edge. Shadows lengthened across the tarmac, giving everything a gentler shape. When the aircraft was finally cleared, the new crew moved with quiet efficiency. No speeches, no reassurances, just checklists, spoken cleanly, evenly, the way they were meant to be. As the engine spooled, Marianne took her seat again, this time in the left. The leather was cool against her palms, familiar, earned. Alan Pierce glanced over. Your aircraft, he said, not as a title, as a fact. She nodded. For today. Harold settled in behind them. As the door closed and the cabin sealed, he felt a strange sense of calm. He had boarded expecting convenience. He was leaving with something rarer. Confidence. The takeoff was smooth, clean. The city fell away beneath them, the grid dissolving into desert and distance. Marianne kept her eyes forward, hands steady, mind clear. There was no victory here, only alignment. At altitude, the cabin settled into a comfortable hush. Alan broke the silence first. You fly often? Enough, she said. He waited. Then, gently, hard day. She considered that. Necessary day. He nodded. Those are the ones people remember. Below them, the ground stretched on, indifferent to the drama it had hosted. Above them, the sky remained what it always was. Honest, demanding, unimpressed by ego. Back in the terminal, Douglas stood at the edge of the parking lot, the sun low behind him. His car sat alone, dust collecting on the hood. He unlocked it and paused before getting in. For the first time in decades, there was no next flight on his schedule. No call to make, no one waiting on his decision. He sat behind the wheel and rested his forehead against it. The leather was warm. He closed his eyes and breathed, slow and shallow. He did not cry. He did not curse. He simply sat with the weight of the day, the realization settling like sediment. He had believed the sky belonged to him. That belief had carried him far. It had also blinded him. High above, Marianne adjusted their heading, her movements precise. She thought of the moment Douglas had looked at the placard and finally seen what had been in front of him all along. Not ownership, responsibility. She glanced at Alan. You ever notice how quiet it gets when things are finally right? He smiled. That's how you know. The aircraft moved west, steady and true. Behind them, something old loosened its grip. Ahead, the air was clear, and for once, no one mistook silence for obedience. The sun dipped low enough to turn the cockpit glass amber. The desert below softened into long shadows and quiet geometry, roads dissolving into thin lines, mountains folding back into themselves. Marianne adjusted the trim with a light touch, feeling the aircraft respond the way a living thing does when it trusts the hands guiding it. Alan Pierce watched her without staring. He had flown with hundreds of captains. He knew the difference between command and control. One demanded, the other listened. Fuel looks good, he said. Winds are kinder than forecast. They usually are when you give them room, Marianne replied. He nodded, understanding more than she had said. Behind them, Harold Bennett sat with his eyes closed, not sleeping, just listening. The rhythm of flight, the subtle shifts. He had spent a lifetime in boardrooms where silence was always tactical. Up here, silence felt earned. For a while, nothing happened, and that was the point. Miles away, in a quiet office near the edge of the airport, Douglas Kincaid sat across from a woman who did not wear a uniform. Her nameplate read, Compliance Review. Her desk was bare except for a legal pad and a pen aligned perfectly along its top edge. "Walk me through your decision," she said. Douglas leaned back, crossing his arms, then uncrossing them. He had tried the posture of authority. It no longer fit. "I had concerns." "About the aircraft?" she asked. "About the crew," he said. She waited. He shifted. "About compatibility." The pen scratched once across the paper. "Define that." Douglas opened his mouth, closed it. He felt something unfamiliar rise in his chest. Not anger, not fear. Exposure. "I didn't trust her," he said finally. The woman looked up. "Based on what?" Douglas stared at the wall behind her. Certificates framed in cheap wood. Years of quiet work. People like her had always existed on the edges of his career. He had never needed to know their names. "She challenged me," he said, "early, in front of others." Was she wrong? The question landed clean. He had no defense prepared for it. "No," he admitted. The pen moved again. "Then your refusal to fly was not based on safety." Douglas said nothing. "Captain Kincaid," she continued, her voice steady, "we don't discipline people for being old-fashioned. We discipline them for creating risk. Today, you created it." He felt the words settle, heavy, undeniable. Back in the air, Marianne scanned the horizon. The sky ahead was open, forgiving. She had learned not to confuse that with mercy. Aviation had no interest in excuses. Alan glanced at the clock. "We'll make up time." "Let's not," she said. "Let's arrive." He smiled. "Fair." She felt her phone vibrate softly in her pocket. She didn't reach for it yet. Some conversations deserved space. Harold opened his eyes and leaned forward slightly. "I've been thinking," he said. Marianne turned just enough to acknowledge him. "I've fired men like Captain Kincaid," Harold continued. "Some deserved it. Some were victims of their own mythology. They all thought the same thing." "What's that?" Alan asked. "That they were indispensable." Marianne felt a quiet tightening in her chest. "No one is." Harold smiled. "That's why you're still flying." The aircraft leveled. The hum evened out. Below them, the land darkened, lights flickering on in small clusters. Lives intersecting briefly, then diverging again. At the airport they had left behind, Douglas walked out into the cooling evening. The heat had broken. The air smelled of dust and jet fuel and endings. He paused beside his car again, hand on the door, and this time he didn't hesitate. He drove without turning on the radio, without a destination in mind. The road stretched ahead, empty, unclaimed. He realized he didn't know who he was without the cockpit. The thought frightened him more than turbulence ever had. In the cockpit, Marianne finally checked her phone. A single message from Evelyn. "Good. We'll talk tomorrow." No questions, no praise. Just trust. She slipped the phone back and looked forward. The instruments glowed softly, each one telling the truth without judgment. She had built her life around that clarity. It had cost her. It had saved her. Alan broke the silence. "You ever think about how close that came?" "All the time," she said. And I don't think about it twice." He nodded. "That's why you're here." The lights of the destination airport appeared on the horizon, a quiet constellation waiting to be joined. Marianne adjusted their descent, movements smooth, unhurried. She felt the weight of the day settle into something like resolve. Harold buckled his belt as the cabin prepared. He caught Marianne's eye in the mirror between the seats. "You fly like someone who knows where she's going," he said. She considered that. I fly like someone who knows what happens if I don't. The runway rose to meet them, steady and sure. The wheels touched down with a soft certainty. No bounce, no drama. Just the end of one chapter and the beginning of whatever came next. As they taxied in, Marianne felt the quiet satisfaction of work done correctly. Not perfectly. Correctly. She shut down the engines and sat for a moment longer, hands resting on the controls she had never taken for granted. Outside, the night settled in. Inside, the air was calm. Somewhere behind them, a door closed on a career that had mistaken authority for wisdom. Ahead, another opened. Not loudly, not ceremoniously, just enough. The jet rolled to a stop beneath the floodlights, white cones of light washing over the fuselage. The engines wound down with a tired sigh, metal cooling, systems settling into silence. Marianne completed the shutdown checklist from memory, not rushing, not lingering. Every switch moved with intention. Every sound landed where it should. The cabin door opened. Cool night air spilled in, carrying the smell of asphalt and distant ocean. Harold Bennett rose slowly, steadied himself, then paused at the threshold of the cockpit. He did not speak at first. He looked at Marianne the way a man looks at something he did not expect to admire. "I've been flying private for 30 years, he said. "I don't remember the last time I felt this calm getting off a plane." She inclined her head. "That's the goal." He smiled, then extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm, deliberate, respectful. "If you ever decide you're tired of the sky," he added, "there's a chair with your name on it in my office." Marianne released his hand gently. "I'm not tired yet." "I didn't think so," Harold said, and stepped into the night. Alan Pierce remained seated for a moment longer, eyes forward, hands resting loosely in his lap. The adrenaline of the day had finally burned off, leaving behind something quieter. "You know," he said, "most people would have made that personal." She nodded. "Most people do. And you didn't." She took a breath, let it out slowly. "I did. I just didn't let it drive." Alan studied her profile. The lines of her face were calm, but not untouched. Experience had left its mark. "Your sister built something solid," he said. "She built a culture," Marianne replied. "The airplanes came later." He smiled at that. Then he stood, collected his bag, and paused at the cockpit door. "Glad to fly with you," he said, simply. "Likewise," she answered. When he was gone, Marianne remained where she was. The cockpit was dim now, illuminated only by standby lights and the glow from the ramp. She rested her palms against the yoke one last time, feeling the faint warmth left behind by flight. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel it all. The tension, the restraint, the cost. Her phone vibrated again. This time, she answered. "You good?" Evelyn asked, her voice low, familiar. Marianne leaned back in the seat and closed her eyes. "We landed clean." "I heard," Evelyn said. "Operations filled me in." A pause. The kind between sisters who had survived too much together to need words for everything. "He didn't read the bulletin," Marianne said. "I know," Evelyn replied. No anger, no surprise, just confirmation. "Compliance is moving forward." Marianne nodded, though Evelyn couldn't see her. "He won't come back from this." "No," Evelyn said. "But that wasn't your call." Marianne felt a weight lift at the words. "Thank you." "You didn't do this to him," Evelyn added. "He did it to himself." They sat with that for a moment. The truth of it, the fairness, the finality. "Get some rest," Evelyn said. "We'll talk tomorrow." Marianne ended the call and slipped the phone away. She stood, slung her bag over her shoulder, and stepped out onto the stairs. The night wrapped around her, cool and steady. Below, ground crew moved with practiced ease. No drama, no whispers. Just work. She reached the tarmac and paused, looking back at the aircraft. At the name painted near the nose. At the quiet authority of a machine that demanded respect, but offered no favors. Across the country, in a rented room near an unfamiliar highway, Douglas Kincaid sat on the edge of a bed that smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet. His uniform hung over the back of a chair, still crisp, still perfect, utterly useless. He stared at the wall, listening to the hum of traffic beyond the window. For the first time in decades, there was no schedule waiting for him in the morning. No cockpit, no crew, just time. And memory. He thought of the way Marianne had stood her ground, not loudly, not angrily. He wondered how many times he had mistaken that kind of strength for insolence. The thought followed him into the dark. Back on the ramp, Marianne walked toward the terminal, her steps unhurried. The night sky stretched wide above her, stars scattered without pattern or preference. She had learned long ago that the sky did not care who you were, only how you flew. Inside the terminal, the automatic doors slid open. Light spilled out. Conversations hummed. Life continued. Marianne adjusted the strap of her bag and stepped forward. Tomorrow would come, and with it, more tests, more decisions, more moments where silence would be mistaken for weakness. She was ready. Not because she owned the aircraft, but because she understood what it demanded. Morning came without ceremony. A pale strip of light slipped through the curtains of Marianne's hotel room, catching on the edge of the dresser, the metal handle of her flight bag resting against the wall. She woke before the alarm, the way she always did after a long day in the air. Her body remembered responsibility, even when sleep tried to claim more time. She sat up slowly and let the quiet settle. No engines, no radios, just the distant sound of traffic and the soft click of the air conditioner cycling on and off. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to feel the absence of pressure. Then she stood. By the time she reached the operations building, the day had already begun to organize itself. Phones rang, printers hummed, screens flickered with routes, weather systems, and timelines that never cared who was tired or shaken. Marianne walked through it all without hurry, nodding to people who met her eyes, noting who looked away. In the glass-walled conference room, Evelyn waited alone. She stood when Marianne entered, not out of formality, but habit. They hugged briefly. No words yet. Sisters first, professionals second. "You okay?" Evelyn asked. Marianne nodded. "I slept. That's more than I expected." They sat. The table between them was bare. No folders, no lawyers. Just two women who understood that the hardest conversations didn't need props. "He called it compatibility," Marianne said. Evelyn exhaled through her nose. "They always do." "I don't think he saw me as a person," Marianne continued. "I think he saw a disruption." Evelyn leaned back, eyes fixed on the ceiling for a moment. "Disruptions expose things." A knock at the door interrupted them. David Morales, head of compliance, stepped in. Late 40s, careful posture. A man who understood systems and feared chaos. He carried a single folder, thin but heavy with consequence. "We've completed the initial review," he said. "Captain Kincaid is suspended, pending the FAA inquiry." Marianne felt something tighten, then release. Not relief, resolution. "He won't be flying for a while," David continued. "Possibly ever." Evelyn nodded. "That's not our call." "No," David agreed. "But our documentation is clean." Marianne watched his hands as he spoke. Steady, controlled. He was a man who liked certainty. She wondered how often he had chosen quiet over confrontation in the past. how many small moments had added up to yesterday. "There's something else," David said. He hesitated. "This isn't isolated." Evelyn's gaze sharpened. "Go on." "We pulled anonymous feedback from the last 3 years," he said. "Patterns. Senior captains overruling concerns, junior crew backing down. Not always malicious. Sometimes just habit." Marianne felt a familiar weight settle in her chest. The thing she had known without proof. The thing no one wanted to name, because naming it required action. Evelyn folded her hands on the table. "What are you recommending?" "A full audit," David said. "Third party, culture, decision-making, command behavior." Silence followed. Heavy. Necessary. Marianne broke it. "Some people will leave." David nodded. "Yes." Evelyn looked at her sister. "Some should." David left them then, the door closing softly behind him. Outside, the building continued to function, unaware of the shift beginning inside it. Evelyn stood and walked to the window. She looked out at the ramp, at the aircraft lined up in quiet obedience. "I didn't build this company to protect comfort," she said. "I built it to protect lives." Marianne joined her. "Then don't soften this." Evelyn turned. "I won't." Later that day, Douglas Kincaid sat across from a federal investigator in a room that smelled faintly of coffee and toner. The questions were precise, unemotional. They did not accuse. They did not console. They asked him to explain his choices. He tried, at first. Then the words thinned. Justifications collapsed under their own weight. He heard himself speak and did not recognize the man talking. A man who had confused seniority with exemption. A man who had stopped reading because he believed he already knew. When it ended, the investigator closed her notebook and stood. "You're free to go," she said, "for now." Douglas remained seated. Free was not the word he felt. Back at operations, Evelyn stood before a room of managers and captains. No podium, no slides, just her voice. "We don't worship experience here," she said. "We rely on it. There's a difference." Eyes shifted. Some nodded. Some hardened. "If you can't be questioned," she continued, "you shouldn't be in command." Marianne watched from the back of the room. She saw fear, resistance, relief. The mix that always came before change. That evening, alone again, Marianne returned to her room and set her bag down by the door. She sat on the edge of the bed and finally let the day catch up with her. The fatigue came in waves. Earned. Honest. She thought of Douglas, of Harold, of Evelyn standing at the window, choosing discomfort over decay. Outside, the city moved on. Planes rose and fell. People trusted systems they never saw. Marianne lay back and closed her eyes. Tomorrow, the audit would begin. And with it, the slow work of reshaping something that had grown too comfortable in silence. For the first time in a long while, she felt something like hope. The letter arrived 3 weeks later. Cream paper, government seal. No drama in its appearance, only weight. Douglas Kincaid held it in both hands for a long moment before opening it, as if delaying the inevitable might soften the words inside. The apartment around him was quiet, sparsely furnished now. No flight manuals stacked by the door, no uniform hanging within reach. Just space. The FAA determination was concise, procedural, almost merciful in its lack of commentary. His airman certificate was revoked, pending retraining and requalification, contingent on conditions that would take years to satisfy, if they could be satisfied at all. The language did not mention Marianne. It did not mention race. It did not mention pride. It cited failure to comply with mandatory service bulletins, disregard for crew resource management, intent to operate an aircraft under a questionable condition. Facts. Only facts. Douglas lowered himself into the chair by the window. Outside, a delivery truck idled, then pulled away, life moving forward without him. He read the letter again, slower this time. Each sentence stripped another layer of the story he had told himself for decades. That he was careful, that he was irreplaceable, that experience excused shortcuts. He thought of the moment Marianne had asked him a simple question. Was she wrong? He had known the answer then. He had chosen not to say it. Across the country, in a glass conference room overlooking the ramp, the audit briefing began. A neutral firm, no familiar faces. Charts projected quietly onto the wall, patterns highlighted without accusation. Evelyn sat at the head of the table, hands folded, listening without interruption. Marianne sat to her right, silent, eyes on the data. The findings were uncomfortable in their clarity. Senior captains interrupting checklist challenges. Junior crew hesitating before speaking. Maintenance concerns reframed verbally before documentation. Not catastrophic, not malicious, but cumulative. The kind of erosion that only showed itself when someone finally stopped and measured it. "We don't see a culture of recklessness," the lead auditor said. "We see a culture of deference, and that can be just as dangerous." No one argued. Recommendations followed. Mandatory recurrent training. Anonymous reporting channels with teeth. Command reviews tied not to hours logged, but to behavior observed. Some faces tightened. Some relaxed. The room absorbed the cost of change in real time. That evening, Evelyn walked the hangar floor alone. The aircraft rested in their bays, silent, patient. She ran her hand along the fuselage of the one Marianne had flown weeks earlier. Cool metal. Unforgiving. Honest. Her phone buzzed. A message from Harold Bennett. "Contract confirmed. And, for the record, I asked for your sister by name on my next flight." Evelyn allowed herself a small smile. Not triumph. Validation. In his apartment, Douglas folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. He did not tear it up. He did not curse. He sat there until the light outside faded and the room dimmed around him. For the first time since his 20s, no one was waiting on his decision. No clearance to request. No authority to assert. He opened his laptop and typed his name into a search bar. The incident had already been reduced to a few lines on an industry forum. No headlines, no spectacle, just a warning thread. Comments from pilots who recognized the pattern. Some sympathetic, some unforgiving. Most quiet. He closed the laptop. The next morning, Marianne stood in a classroom with a dozen pilots half her age. No uniform, no title on the door, just a whiteboard and a marker. She spoke about decision points, about moments when silence felt easier than friction, about how airplanes did not care about seniority. No one interrupted her. When the session ended, one of the younger pilots lingered. "I would have backed down," he admitted, "in your position." Marianne nodded. "I almost did." He looked surprised. "What stopped you?" She considered the question, knowing what happens when no one speaks. He thanked her and left. That night, Douglas walked past a small flight school near the edge of town. Single-engine trainers sat tied down, wings catching the last light of day. He stopped at the fence and watched a student pre-flight under the watchful eye of an instructor, checklist in hand. Slow, careful, humble. For the first time, he understood something he had spent a lifetime avoiding. Flying had never belonged to him. He had only been trusted with it. He turned away from the fence and walked home. the sound of a small engine starting behind him, steady and patient, carrying someone else into the sky. The call came late in the afternoon, when the light had already begun to soften, and offices everywhere were easing into the quiet lull before evening. Evelyn stood alone in her office, jacket folded over the back of a chair, reviewing notes she had rewritten 3 times already. Some decisions needed distance before they could be trusted. "Put him through," she said. Douglas Kincaid's voice came through the line thinner than she remembered. Not weak, just stripped of its old certainty. "Miss Cole, thank you for taking the call." She did not correct him. She did not invite familiarity. "You asked for 10 minutes. You have them." A pause. She imagined him somewhere small, neutral, a place without windows. "I'm not calling to argue," he said, "or to blame anyone else. I know how that would sound." Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. She had heard too many versions of that sentence over the years. Most were followed by excuses dressed as insight. "I spent my career believing discipline meant control," Douglas continued, "that authority came from being unchallenged. When your sister questioned me, I didn't hear professionalism. I heard threat." Evelyn said nothing. Silence, when used properly, was diagnostic. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "I don't expect anything. I just needed to say that I finally understand what I risked. Not just the aircraft, the trust, the people who assumed I was paying attention." She looked out the window at the ramp below, where a jet was being towed into position with slow precision. Every movement deliberate. "Understanding doesn't restore a certificate," she said evenly. "I know," Douglas replied. "I'm not asking for that." Another pause. Longer this time. "I thought honor meant never backing down," he said. "I see now that it meant knowing when to listen." Evelyn exhaled quietly. "If you believe that," she said, "then don't waste it trying to return to something you're no longer fit for." He hesitated. "What would you have me do?" She considered him then. Not the captain. The man left behind after the uniform was gone. "Teach," she said, "not from authority, from failure. If anyone lets you." There was a sound on the line, not a sob, just breath catching, released. "Thank you," Douglas said. Evelyn ended the call without ceremony. That evening, she stood before a small group of senior staff. Not all of them were comfortable being there. Some wore defensiveness openly. Others masked it with indifference. Evelyn did not raise her voice. "We are not here to punish," she said. "We are here to correct." She outlined the changes slowly, measured. Command evaluations tied to behavior under challenge. Protected escalation paths. Rotational line flying for leadership. No exceptions. A hand rose near the back. "Some people won't accept this." Evelyn nodded. "Then they won't stay." No anger, no threat, just consequence. Across town, Marianne sat alone at her kitchen table, a mug of tea cooling in front of her. The day had been long, but lighter than the weeks before it. She read the message from Evelyn twice, then set the phone down. She thought of Douglas, of the fence, of the student pilot with the checklist. She wondered if he would ever stand in front of a room again, not as a captain, but as a caution. Outside, the sky darkened into blue and then black. A plane passed overhead, lights blinking, steady and anonymous. Marianne smiled faintly. The system was changing, slowly, imperfectly, but it was moving. And this time, it was moving, because someone had finally refused to confuse silence with respect, or authority with wisdom. Tomorrow, there would be more resistance, more conversations that ended badly, more people who would leave rather than adapt. But tonight, for the first time since the incident, the air felt clear. Not forgiving. Clear. The auditorium was quiet in the way only disciplined spaces ever were. Not empty, controlled. Rows of seats filled slowly, the sound of jackets brushing fabric, shoes finding place, low conversations stopping one by one as attention gathered toward the front. No stage lights, no dramatic music. Just a plain lectern, a microphone, and a large window behind it looking out onto a hangar where aircraft rested like sleeping animals. Marianne Cole stood off to the side, arms loosely folded, watching people take their seats. Pilots, dispatchers, maintenance leads. A few executives who had chosen to attend rather than delegate. These carried different expressions: curiosity, skepticism, relief. A few showed irritation they hadn't bothered to hide. She recognized the look. She had worn it herself once, years ago, when she believed endurance was the same thing as strength. Evelyn stepped forward without announcement. She didn't wait for applause, and none came. She rested her hands on the lectern and looked at the room the way a commander surveys terrain. Calm, intentional, precise. "This isn't a town hall," she began. "It's not a motivational talk. It's an alignment." The words settled. Some shifted in their seats. "For decades," Evelyn continued, "this industry rewarded one kind of excellence. Hours logged, missions survived, voices that filled rooms. That model carried us far. It also left blind spots." She paused, letting the hangar behind her come into view through the glass. A mechanic walked slowly along a fuselage, flashlight tracing a line of rivets with reverence. "Blind spots don't announce themselves," she said. "They wait." Marianne felt the room tighten. This wasn't about one man. Everyone knew that. That knowledge pressed against ribs and memory. "We recently experienced an incident that forced clarity," Evelyn went on. "Not because of how loud it was, but because of how ordinary it felt. A disagreement, a challenge dismissed, a concern nearly overridden. No names, no need." "Nothing failed," Evelyn said. "That's the lie we tell ourselves. We say we were lucky. We say experience prevailed. In truth, we were close to being wrong." Silence. Heavy. Necessary. Evelyn turned her head slightly, eyes finding Marianne for the briefest moment. No signal. No reassurance. Just acknowledgement. "We've completed our audit," Evelyn said. "The results are not catastrophic. They are worse. They are familiar." A murmur passed through the room, then died. "We found patterns," she continued. "Deference mistaken for respect. Seniority mistaken for exemption. Silence mistaken for agreement. These are not personality flaws. They are systemic failures." Someone in the third row crossed his arms. Someone else leaned forward. "Effective immediately," Evelyn said. "Command authority here will be defined by behavior under challenge, not by tenure, not by reputation. If you cannot be questioned, you will not be in command." A breath moved through the room like a wave. Some exhaled, some held it. "We will retrain," she said. "We will re-qualify. We will remove barriers that punish people for speaking. And yes, some of you will choose to leave." She did not soften the sentence. She didn't need to. "That is not a threat," Evelyn added. "It is permission." Marianne watched faces change. A man near the aisle nodded slowly, as if something long unspoken had finally been allowed to surface. Another stared straight ahead, jaw tight, already planning his exit. Evelyn stepped back from the lectern. "This company does not belong to tradition. It belongs to the future we're responsible for." She turned and walked off. No applause followed. Not yet. The kind of message that mattered didn't earn immediate reaction. It earned time. Later that afternoon, Marianne stood on the ramp with a small group of trainees, the wind lifting the edges of their jackets. They listened as she spoke, eyes tracking her hands as she demonstrated the walk-around, the pauses, the deliberate order. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize. She explained why every step existed. "This isn't about catching mistakes," she told them. "It's about noticing what doesn't want to be noticed." A young woman with a tight braid asked quietly, "What if the captain doesn't want to hear it?" Marianne met her eyes. "Then you say it anyway. Clearly. Documented. Calm." "And if that costs us?" another asked. Marianne didn't answer immediately. She let the question breathe. "Then it costs us," she said. "But it costs less than silence." Across town, Douglas Kincaid sat in a small classroom with 12 folding chairs and a whiteboard stained by years of dry erase ink. He had been invited, not hired. Allowed to speak, not to instruct. He stood at the front, hands resting lightly on the desk, eyes moving across faces young enough to still believe they were invincible. "I flew for a long time," he said. "Long enough to forget that the sky doesn't care who you are. No defensiveness, no pride, just statement. I confused being trusted with being untouchable," he continued. "That nearly killed people who did trust me." A student shifted uncomfortably. Another leaned in. "If you learn anything from me," Douglas said, "let it be this. The moment you stop listening is the moment you become the most dangerous person in the room." He stepped back, sat down, said no more. As evening settled, Marianne walked alone through the hangar, her footsteps echoing softly. She stopped beside the aircraft that had started it all, resting a hand briefly against its side. Cool, solid, honest. It had never been hers in the way people meant ownership. It was hers in the way responsibility claimed things. Her phone vibrated. A message from Evelyn. Quiet approval, nothing more. Marianne slipped the phone away and looked up at the wide door as it opened, the last light of day pouring in. A plane was being pushed out, nose turning toward the runway. Somewhere, a crew was running a checklist. Somewhere, a voice was being heard that once would not have been. She breathed in, slow and deep. Change did not arrive loudly. It arrived the way flight always did. Through discipline, through attention, through the refusal to look away when something felt wrong. And this time, it held. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like the video, subscribe for more stories like this, and share your thoughts below. Comment these 3 words: truth over ego.